context of minority groups that are characterized by a high level of homophily. So for instance, they work more for women rather than for men, and they work more in the context of ethnic minorities rather than dominant ethnic groups. We find evidence of this rationale, for instance, if we look at crunch-based data, and in particular, we look at the gendered nature of the venture proposal developed by entrepreneurs. So there is evidence that female entrepreneurs are significantly more likely than male entrepreneurs to target women when conceiving a new venture proposal. The same behavior doesn't apply to men with respect to ventures that target the male segment. And this is interesting if we consider that by different metrics, female entrepreneurs that pursue a female-targeted venture idea tend to underperform with respect to female entrepreneurs who develop a venture proposal that targets the general market. Now, what we do in this paper is to inquire deeply in this mechanism by asking to what extent, under what conditions, a mechanism that increases the rigor of the individual decision-making process can address these group membership biases. We do this in a specific context where these group membership biases have proved to be particularly relevant. That is the case of women innovators developing a women-oriented idea. So the innovator in our case is the entrepreneur. The innovative idea has to do with the development of a new value proposition. And the decision potentially affected by group membership biases is the target market selection. Then we focus on the scientific approach as the biasing mechanism. So we can reformulate our research question in this context by asking to what extent and under what conditions the scientific methods can address group membership biases in the case of female entrepreneurs who targets the female market. Let me spend a few minutes on how the scientific methods work as a debiasing mechanism and in which instances we actually think we should find an effect. Now, entrepreneurs who are exposed to the scientific approach undergo a number of stages. The training teaches them how to develop a theory, how to articulate testable hypotheses, how to perform rigorous tests, and how to assess the evidence that comes from this test. Eventually, over the different stages of this journey, the entrepreneur learns how to make the key attributes of the theory explicit, how to collect information that are accurate and complete, and how to process this information in what we call a scientific way. Now, if we apply these specific lessons that entrepreneurs learn from being exposed to the scientific methods to the different scenarios that we can envisage in the context of female entrepreneurs who decide to target a female venture proposal, we do not expect the scientific methods to have any effect on female entrepreneurs who decided to target the female markets because of superior information. These are already entrepreneurs who make their decision based on complete and accurate information, and that indeed process this information in the correct way. So if anything, the scientific approach should reinforce their decision about their market. We expect a negligible effect on entrepreneurs who make their decision based on belief biases. This because the decision process of these entrepreneurs is not really baked up by information. And we know from existing research that belief-based biases are much more resilient to change than information-based biases. We do expect, however, to observe a significant change among entrepreneurs who make their decision based on incomplete or biased information. These are those that should be more significantly affected by the nature of the scientific approach. Based on these intuitions, we developed two main hypotheses. The first one suggests that in contexts that are potentially characterized by group membership biases, female entrepreneurs, such as the one of female entrepreneurs who targets the female market, the scientific approach should lead to changes in the value proposition. And then hypothesis 2, which suggests that these changes should indeed be more significant when their behavior is informed by imperfect information rather than belief-based biases. We test these two hypotheses by using data from 3 randomized control trials that have been run in the UK and in Italy. We have a sample of 136 female entrepreneurs who are observed over different interviews round. Our dependent variable of interest is pivot, which basically is a dummy that captures the probability to make changes to the value proposition, the customer base, or key firm activity. The treatment group includes entrepreneurs who undergo the scientific treatment, and then we use entrepreneurial pitches to identify venture proposal who targets the female market. We employ a difference in difference research design such that our coefficient of interest, beta 1, captures the relative change in the pivoting probability of treated entrepreneurs with a female-oriented venture proposition with respect to those with a general market venture proposal with respect to individuals in the control group. Now, preliminary descriptive evidence from our data suggests that entrepreneurs in the control group are more likely to pivot unless they develop a female-targeted idea. In this latter case, treated entrepreneurs are significantly more likely to make change to their value proposition with respect to the control group. So this preliminary descriptive evidence indeed seems to support our main hypothesis, which is further confirmed when we go into the data and we test it via our econometric specification. So we find that female entrepreneurs with a female-targeted value proposition do pivot more after being exposed to the scientific approach. To test hypothesis 2, we collect information on the importance of, we collect records on the importance of information versus beliefs in the decision-making process of the entrepreneur, and also information on heterogeneity in self-efficacy beliefs. Both records allow us to provide a formal test of hypothesis 2, and we do find, in line with our expectations, that those entrepreneurs that change their value proposition are those that are mainly informed by incomplete information rather than belief-based biases. We run a number of robustness checks that has to do with the sample composition, with the specification we employ, with the power of the experiments, and we also try to provide evidence of the generalizability of our results beyond the context of women entrepreneurs, focusing in particular on the case of ethnic entrepreneurs who develop an ethnic value proposition. We are, just to conclude, we are also in the context of a follow-up study that aims at going deeper into these topics. This involves new RCTs in Spain and in India, which are developed in collaboration with Claudia Frosi, which is one of our great PhD students at Bocconi, Miriam Mariani and Giorgio Drakis at ESADE. And in the context of this new RCT, we included contextually to the scientific treatment as a manipulation that is aimed at increase the entrepreneur's awareness of biases that are potentially stemming from their individual domains. So you will know more about this, hopefully soon. Thank you.
Let's hear for questions, Luisa. Any questions? Yes. Go ahead.
Thank you.
I have one quick word. Were the experiments pre-registered? And to what extent, like down to the specification or just the hypotheses? What?
This is a good question. So we pre-registered the experiments. The initial pre-registration of the experiments referred to the general framework, the general test of the hypothesis about the scientific methods. Then we updated our registration to include new research questions and new methodologies that we used in order to address these side research questions that test the boundary conditions of the scientific method. So there are now a number of people working on this project, which has grown a lot. And of course, all of us has somehow found an angle that is more in line with our own research interest. So we try to update the registration accordingly.
So it's post-registration.
I think probably Elena can help me with this about the specific registration procedure that we undergone for.
I think this is a good forum to have a conversation about also what would be the appropriate norms in general. So the way we thought about this problem is that at the time in which we started the experiment, we had a set of ideas that we really wanted to look at, and so obviously we pre-registered those. But then additional questions came up, and we realized that we had the opportunity to see whether the data had an answer to those questions. So the question that we asked ourselves as a group is what would be the right thing to do in this case. And so we basically thought of updating with, so in that sense, that part is post-registered, updating the registration that we had with details about what we were going to do next. So one thing that is interesting, I think, here is the fact that there is not really a norm there to follow. So we had to have a conversation among ourselves, but also taking the feedback of other scholars as a community in terms of what's the best thing to do, because we feel that what we do now will affect PhD students who will look at our work and so on and so forth. So,
why don't we take this conversation after the session? I would like to turn into a very important conversation.
Yeah, I'm happy to interrupt, Brent. So this is definitely more of a comment than a question, but you raised some awesome points here. Particularly, I was thinking about how I sort of connect scientific entrepreneurship to gender, and I think the way you've done is really interesting and provocative. But I raised a deeper question of like, where is this scientific approach potentially less useful? So if I like waved a magic wand and suddenly all entrepreneurs were at the frontier of being scientific, what areas would we see less entrepreneurship, right? And which areas would we see more, right? And so you can imagine if there's less examples, less data about women, it's harder there. If I'm trying to quantify that uncertainty, it might be harder to build models. And so as I'm weighing my cost benefits of where do I invest my time to collect knowledge, I might focus more on male areas. I think going beyond gender, you can imagine this with technology. So this reminds me of Raman Ananda and co-authors have a paper that AWS lowers the cost of starting app startups. So VCs potentially move to sort of the spray and pray, let's just invest in small, silly ideas versus sort of bigger, harder ideas. I think sort of more generally, I'd love to see, as you continue with this work and run new experiments, thinking about sort of distortions in the direction of innovation, if we all go scientific. Because it seems to have a lot of benefits, but
that's I think is a very interesting comment about the future of this research line. I want to just mention a caveat that I think is important to notice. What we are going to say here is not that an entrepreneur, a female entrepreneur in our specific case, but again, we can generalize it to different contexts. We are not saying that a female entrepreneur who targets the female markets is necessarily an unsuccessful entrepreneur. What we are saying is that what makes the difference is how to get to the decision to target that market. If that decision is informed by a correct way of collecting information, theorizing developing your theory, and assessing this information, the probability of success of your venture are not necessarily lower than that of an entrepreneur who targets the general market. So what makes the difference is the process that you employ to make the decision about, in our specific case, the target market selection. So this is an interesting context because we know from the literature that these group membership biases work particularly in the context of women entrepreneurs targeting women domains, which may be technology or maybe, in our case, entrepreneurship. But basically, this gives us an interesting context. We are not making a judgment ex ante about the validity of this entrepreneurial strategy per se. Is the process, the nature of the decision-making process which makes the difference.
All right, well, let's give Luisa a big hand of applause. And the microphone is for recording.
Okay.
You should be all set.
All right. Thank you. So this is a paper about the division of labor, and you can see that working here. Both my co-authors live much closer to London than I do, but I have been sent with this task. So this is joint work, by the way. With Andrea and Thomas Ronde, who should have been here but chose not to. Right. So just a little, what's this paper about? It's about, as some of you may know, I've been working on this idea of the changing nature of the innovation ecosystem in America, and in particular on this old idea of this division of innovative labor. And the basic idea there is some firms, typically startups, small firms, are better at solving technical challenges, and the established firms, incumbents, are better at solving commercial, at scaling up and commercialization. That's the idea. Connecting them is the market for technology or the market for startups. We now, I have been persuaded that this division of labor is very exciting and useful, but potentially is unbalanced. And there's evidence, for example, that a lot of this, the startup activity is concentrated in a couple of sectors, IT and life sciences. And in particular, what entrepreneurs seem to be doing less of is what's been called deep tech, climate technology. And Ramana Ananda, who is now at Imperial, has made this point very eloquently. The question is why? Okay? And there are many reasons. I want to talk about one. This paper is focused on one reason that I think has not got enough attention. Okay? So there are many reasons. These could be lower value, higher cost. VCs could be biased. I want to focus on one characteristic that I think has not been sufficiently appreciated, which is that there are all innovation projects face many challenges. It's useful to compress them for analytical clarity into two: technical challenges, you could think of as technical uncertainties or technical efforts, and we call commercial challenges, scaling up, commercialization, marketing, that sort of stuff, okay? I'm oversimplifying, but it's useful for this conversation to do that. And this is an example of these two kinds of challenges. And the point being made here that I hope to at least persuade you to start thinking about is that the ratio or the share of these two types of, the relative importance of these two types of challenges is important because they affect value capture in the market for technology. That's if you want the lead of the story, that's the lead, is that the ability of the startup to capture value depends on the combination of these challenges. Okay? And in particular, if you're a startup, it's better to have one of these challenges, but not a combination. And I'll make that more precise formally. But that's sort of the idea, that there's this non-monotone relationship between the ratio of the share of technical to overall challenges. And as this ratio changes, the value capture ability of the startup first falls and then starts to rise, leading to the title of this missing middle, or the stuck in the middle. Okay. So this is not an empirical paper. It's a simple stylized model, and it's got essentially three key components. One is a modeling assumption, which is I'm going to look at a whole bunch of projects which all have the same value and all have the same total cost. So that's not going to change. Which means from the, if you think about, if somehow these could be executed inside a single organization, the organization would be indifferent between all of these projects. All of these projects would have the same net return or the same NPV. So that's a modeling assumption, just to kind of clear out all the other stuff. Second is I'm going to assume that we are in this new division of labor, and in particular, startups are better at solving technical challenges, and incumbents are better at solving commercial challenges, which means there are gains from trade, which means we need a market to get these two things together. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to assume the startup is going to sell itself to the incumbent. So in the simplest game, there's one startup, one incumbent. We could make it a lot more complicated, but that would be like the conjuring trick, because this is where all the rabbits go into the hat. This is where everything happens, so this is the honest way. If you don't like it, that's okay, but this is where the trick happens. Third, I'm going to assume you cannot write an ex-ante contract, because if there's one startup, one incumbent, it's natural, hey, why don't we contract ex-ante? There are ways to do this formally, but what I need for this to work is that the startup must do its investing before there is a contract from the incumbent, okay? This part is well known. This is a problem of sequential innovation. Scotchmer and Greed 20 years ago said, hey, if you have this, you'll have an inefficiency. That's not the contribution of this paper. So we agreed that they've done this. The contribution is this hold-up problem, which we know exists, it's a lot worse in the middle. It's much easier on the ends. That's the contribution. There's this kind of non-monotonicity, and I'll show you why this happens. So far, so good? Okay. I probably shouldn't do this. It's too late in the day. All right, I'm going to skip this and tell you why. So here's why this happens. There are two forces going on. So just to be concrete, low technical uncertainty is, think about an app, right? Writing the app is not the hard part. Finding people who want to download and buy the app and use it, that's the hard part. At the other end is life sciences. Finding people who want to be cured of cancer is not the hard part. Curing cancer, that's the hard part. That's technical challenge. Combination, I showed you iRobot. You need to solve technical challenges, and you need to figure out who wants to use this thing for what. Okay? Now, if you just think about the simple Scotchmer problem, the hold-up problem, you'd think, hey, the problem is the most for the biotech because you spend all this money, right? That's the biggest share of your investment. You're going to get held up. Yes, that's true. But because the commercial challenges are smaller, the biotech has an outside option, which is it can go to the market itself, credibly. On the other hand, if you think about the app company, because the commercial challenges are the biggest, it doesn't have a credible way of going to the market, so it doesn't have a good outside option when it's bargaining with the incumbent. But the good part is you didn't spend very much. You had 4 guys spending a few weeks to make an app. So the amount of the hold up, the investment that's being held up is also small. This is why the division of labor works well at the extremes. It works well for apps, it works well for startups. In the middle is the problem. All right? That's where all this, not all this, this is, pedestrian algebra. That's where this algebra gets you. In 15 minutes, you should expect to get the trailer of the movie, so read the paper. But basically, if you think about this, on this axis, you can imagine the share of technical challenges. It's the lowest here, so apps are here, biotech is here. And this is the value of the startup. Now, why is the value of startup like this? Well, it depends on what the bargaining power of the startup looks like. That's constant. What changes here, as you go here, the startup has more and more upfront investment, and is bargaining with the incumbent after sinking this investment. So this is the hostage problem or the sequential innovator problem. So this is why it keeps falling. The value of the startup keeps falling because, remember, I fixed by assumption the net value that you can create. So all of this is being driven by value capture. On this side, what starts to happen? This side, the outside option of going to the market yourself or commercializing this innovation yourself starts to kick in. Till here, it's not credible. At some point, it becomes credible. Our world is linear. That's why you see this sharp kink. And this is where this starts. And if you increase the value, total net value being created, all these curves will move up, but they retain this shape. Okay? And the takeaway from this is it may not be a problem of VC bias. It's rational. It's the startup has just the value of the startup, if you think about it as an enterprise, is smaller in the middle, not because of that it's creating different amounts of value, but because of its ability to capture value. I should stop here because I'm out of time.
No, you still have a minute.
What? Let's go.
We'll have questions then for Ashish. Yes.
So, super interesting. I'm wondering, in a sense, it seems as if you're assuming that value creation is linear or increases with the total level of the combined level of challenges, right? But it might mean that those industries, or those that are there in the middle, in reality are facing a higher total cost or a higher total challenges, and therefore they are not creating value. Would that be an alternative explanation?
Yeah, so absolutely. So what Arnaldo said is I did the modeler's trick of assuming that the gross value created is the same for all, and the net value created is the same because the sum of the technical plus commercial cost is constant in all of these. In reality, who knows? But if that was true, you don't need the model. I mean, then you've assumed the answer. The trick in modeling is to say, it's not what you thought, right? Even if you don't assume that, Arnaldo, you could still get this. That's sort of the point.
So my question is that probably it's not in your model, so it looks like the one in the middle, they are not being developed. But it is at some point, what do you think happened to them over time?
Okay, so thank you. In this case, they would be developed. It's just they would be less exciting. If you were an entrepreneur, when you go to the VC and you ask for a certain amount of money, your pre-money valuation is smaller. So if you want to test this empirically, if you could figure out a way to measure gross, the actual value created, you could look at pre-money valuations, right, to test this idea. Is that answering your question?
So my question is actually related to how early stage in the market, like maybe in the beginning, you don't get developed. Can you say anything about over time?
No.
Thank you.
Amisha?
When I think about assets, a startup with a commercial asset is attractive to a VC, and a startup with a technological asset can be attractive to a VC or an incumbent. Would we get the same model if we just modeled this as if it was like an asset?
Yeah, so I think yes. What's important is the combination of these two. So what's important is, in order to realize the value V, you need some technical stuff and some commercial stuff. And what's happening here is the combination of how much technical to how much commercial.
So I would be buying a bit of the market and a bit of a technology in the middle.
No, the sale always happens because it's efficient to sell when the startup has finished the technical business. So you're not buying any. If you're the startup, there is no reason for you to buy real estate from a startup. That's nuts. That's bad use of money.
All right, one more question. I think
Now you ask me.
Was it pre-registered? No.
Yep, it was.
I think, like, for your next paper,
Uh-huh.
I think it'd be really interesting to think of how we might expect these values to change over time in different industry evolution scenarios. So I'll just give you some examples. In a market where there's a shock that suggests high value, like it all shifts up, and how companies think about the timing of that. Or alternatively, somebody goes in, like people get this wrong because this is all uncertain, these actual values, and they go and they demonstrate that you can commercialize or something like that.
Yep.
And then all of a sudden the market jumps, and the sequence of that can happen over years in some of these deep tech things. So it's like the short run really matters.
Yeah.
And it'd be really interesting to think about that.
I 100% agree. I will just repeat. Models are devices to make one point clear, or to highlight one point. And the point here I want to highlight is your value capture is the worst in the middle, which you should think about, Brent. for reasons Brent will know. All right.
Thank you so much.
All right, I have to time myself, so
Giovanni will keep it honest.
you can tell me when I have 2 minutes left. So when it's at 10. Well, this is a super honor to be part of this session, and I also have to say it's really interesting to see how we all have different methods. So we had an experiment, we had a model. I'm now going to do a very, very archival data approach, and I believe Rashari will have another approach as well. So it's going to be really fun to see all these 4 in one session. So this project is with Astrid Marinoni, who's at Georgia Tech and an assistant professor. I am an assistant professor in the strategy unit at HBS. Have been there for 2 years now. And the project was a bit of a pet project, but I'll get into the details of what motivated us to do this project in 1 second. But first, what is this paper about? So here we're trying to we're asking the question, empirically, what the impact of the US Postal Service expansion, which is a major institutional innovation of the time in the 19th century, played on firm entry, and also what kind of implications it may have had for firm performance. So that's why I said very, very archival. We're going back way, way in the past. And just to give you an idea what I mean with institutional innovation, this is really, in essence, thinking about a new and more efficient system to encourage people's behavior. So this is kind of what we're thinking about. Now, what got us motivated for this project? So both Astrid and I have a lot in common. One thing was that we started our first academic jobs during the pandemic, right at the height in 2020. We felt very isolated because we had visa issues, weren't allowed to leave the country, and we're like, missing our families who were abroad, and really got to cherish, the communication channels we did have. And another thing we did is we started a book club to kind of keep ourselves motivated and keep the friendship alive. And that one was this, and during this book club, we hit this book, which is called Paper Trails. And all of us who've worked with patents or innovation know with paper trails, you get really excited, patent citations. These are very different paper trails. It's actually looking at mail in this book. And the book also had data that was put up by the author, which really located each post office from the 1840s up to 1910, which is what we're using as our main data source to kind of understand where the post offices were located. So this was the motivation of why we actually started this project. Now, why should we even care about this, right? It's old news, 1800s, why should we even think about this? And well, there's a long-standing innovation literature that has been really suggesting and pushing forward that we need to understand the institutional factors of driving innovation and entrepreneurship and how they also influence technological progress, right? And the factors that a lot of people have studied are, amongst others, property rights, patent law, or even general competition policy. But we don't really know how much these factors, and the one that we're going to be looking at specifically, contribute to the pace and direction of entrepreneurship. We know a lot about innovation, but less about the entrepreneurship side. And one such structure is the US Postal Service, which was created in a really weird, different way from all other institutions at that time. It was created as a gossamer network, which is a web that's very fragile, and expanded super fast across the whole country, especially through the West. Now, this is what a post office looked like. So very different from what we think of a post office today. So it was on the side, right over here, on the side of this roadhouse. So little tiny, constructions that were just built very quickly in that time. Now, why is this context so different? So I was saying this was an institutional innovation. So why is this so different? So early on, the US government contracted with people, with independent agents, and asked them to kind of take care of this big task for them. They didn't own or operate most of the postal infrastructure. This was all outsourced. And they crafted temporary and part-time arrangements to make sure that the post was delivered. And this was the way they approached the expansion, and this is why the expansion was able to go so quickly and so pervasively across the whole country. So now, I was talking about this project is a lot about the data behind it because it was very difficult to get the information that we needed to actually pursue this project. And so just to show you the different sources we used to get, for one, we're also now focusing on the time of 1880 to 1890. There are very many reasons why we did that. One of them is our outcome variable. The other one is things that were happening in the United States. We wanted to make sure we're not, conflating anything with the Civil War as well. And then later on, the US Post had the airmail and all these other changes. So we really wanted to focus on a time period where we could cleanly estimate the effect. Now, the post office data comes from the book I was telling you before. We also have the full road network of California, and we're focusing our study on California, which is the biggest state in the West. We hand drew all of these road networks because it does not exist in a digitized form. So this is a lot of work. We had information on railroads and waterways as well, historic trails, weather conditions. These two variables we're going to exploit for our instrumental variable approach. And the most important part, the crucial part of our project, is the data on entry and performance, which comes from the Dunn and Co. credit report archives that are located at HBS in the library. And these are really fragile documents that are handwritten. And so just for those of you who have ever been at HBS, this credit report, these archives were donated to the school. And if you walk through our tunnels, you'll see this big placard, which kind of represents also what this project is about, where we see the men of the East with the high rises versus the men of the West and how they're being connected through this kind of credit report. But this is actually what the data look like. So we had to go into these data to kind of understand what kind of information we can get out of it. It's so rich, it actually gives you character descriptions of each of the entrepreneurs. It goes so deep that it tells you the drinking habits and the, the state of the marriages of certain individuals. So if you want to know about that, this is where you got to go. So our empirical approach is really, because of the time frame we're looking at, just a first differenced approach. Naively, this is what we're going to do. We include a host of fixed effects, and we really want to understand the growth, so the number of new firms in a city by sector. And we also and then post office is in this equation equals 1 if there was at least one new post office within 20 kilometers of the city. And so just to give you an idea what that looks like for California, so you see a lot of variation in terms of post office deaths, these are in red, and there where there's a lot of growth, which is the super green. This is the road network, which we hand drew, so you can see the detail we had to go into. And just from a naive perspective, our results without any instruments, anything at all, just the fixed effects model, we see that including a host of different controls, that our results seem to be pretty robust and suggest that there's a positive relationship with having a new post office and growth in entrepreneurship. Now, naturally, there are a lot of empirical challenges we have to deal with. One is omitted variable bias. We try to do that with our host of fixed effects. There's also reverse causality, and the way we approach this is by doing a simple test that has been done before in research, and where we see if future presence of a post office can predict the present growth of entrepreneurship. And we don't seem to see any relationship here, which gives us some confidence. Of course, this is not a perfect test, but to some extent, this can help us be a little more confident that it's not reverse causality. So it's not businesses are attracting post offices. So there. And now in our instrumental variable approach, I was already mentioning, we're going to exploit historic trails and also weather conditions. I'll give you a more explanation as to why we're doing that in a moment, but just to give you an understanding, in California, you had a lot of these historic pioneer trails that went through passes that were not necessarily the best ways to go, but they started out that way and then kind of got established as the routes to come into California. We also look at extreme weather conditions, so if there was a lot of rain or a lot of heat, because this impacted a lot of agriculture businesses, which we're not measuring. So this is one of the instruments we're using as well. And when we look at the instrumental variable approach results, we see that indeed the historic trails predict where there is a post office. And when we include it in the second stage, we can interpret the results such that if we take the average of post offices, the averages of businesses in a city, which was about 25, this coefficient means that in the next decade, there would have been a growth of about 40 more businesses. So just to give a bit of an understanding what this coefficient means. Now, in interest of time, I'm just going to skip through the rest of the results. Thank you. And what we see is, though, when we use both instruments and we do the include the test for the Hansen-J statistic, that this is not significant, so it kind of gives us a bit more support that our instruments are actually valid. So now in terms of potential mechanisms, what we look at are 4 different potential explanations as to why the post office actually promoted entrepreneurship. One is that it was a monetary distribution center. The other one that it was served as a legal institution. The third one is that it streamlined communication, and the fourth one is that it facilitated knowledge exchange. We got data from different sources to do this, again, not so straightforward. And just briefly, because in interest of time to tell you, the one explanation that seems to be sticking out is the one on specialized knowledge, which we measure using trade journals. So this seems to be the one channel that explains our results. Now moving to firm performance, I promise this is my last slide with content. Just really briefly, we moved this to the firm level to try and understand how this also helped firm performance. We look at different channels here again because in our main regression we see a zero effect. So we're seeing maybe there's something heterogeneous, some differences depending on what was there that's going on. And so here we look at competition, quality, and knowledge and technology channels again. And as we can see here on the slide, so in areas where there was a lot of competition, having a post office actually was negative in terms of firm performance, naturally because you have more entrants, and so the competition was a bit stronger. In terms of quality, we don't really see any differences. And then again, the knowledge channel, here really important, if the firm was able to benefit from knowledge, so from these trade journals, and this special one, we can talk more about it, is the use of seeds. These firms were the ones who actually benefited the most from having a new post office. And just to give you an idea, the seeds were actually distributed through the post, used to be part of the patent office, which then became the USDA, and they were sent for free via the post office. Now, really brief summary. So we find that the post office contributed to firm growth. We also find that there's very nuanced performance implications, and this points to the role of the post office as carrier of knowledge, which comes from this poem, which you will find on the Smithsonian in DC, which was actually written by a former president of Harvard. Here are the pictures. So thanks a lot. All right, any questions? Rem.
So, question on post office and recording, right? So, like, just because the Dun & Bradstreet says someone didn't drink or did drink, right, we may not believe what they wrote down. And I'm wondering how much Dun & Bradstreet, or if you have evidence on this, relied on the post office for its recordings, right? So you can imagine that changes what gets reported and if there's ways around that. I know that's like a super annoying thing, but I think with a lot of this history stuff, it's sort of like, it's a measurement, and like all measurement, there's error, right? So I don't know if you have anything sort of all around that.
Yeah, of course, like you had to get the information to Dun & Brad, so yes, that does make sense. We did read into that as far as we could. Of course, whatever's given to us may have been changed or censored in a way, but it seems they had agents everywhere, and they were motivated to give correct information because they also then got the information from Dun & Brad for free. That was kind of how they contributed to it. So I would say the information that is there is pretty accurate. Again, how much that is influenced by it being a post office or not, hard to say, but it wasn't that these were the postmasters that were giving the information. So it was like individual agents that were wandering around often. Yeah. Any more questions? Otherwise, I'll hand it over to Rashri. Okay. Oh, Graham has another one.
Brett told me to ask this. Was it pre-registered?
In 1700.
Yeah.
Okay, good evening. I'm stopping you on the last session presenter of the day after a very, very long day. Good evening, everyone. This is a paper that Sojin Kim was supposed to present, so I'm going to channel my inner Sojin here. She's on the market, awesome. You should take a strong look at her. So this is based actually on her dissertation study, and it's co-authored with Brent as well. And it's titled Creating Competencies for Radical Technologies, Revisiting Incumbent Entrant Dynamics in the Bionic Prosthetic Industry. And yes, you can say this. Rashri, do we really need another study of radical technologies and incumbent entrant dynamics? Hasn't there been so much work that's already done? Yes. And in fact, as you're going to see, we're going to focus in this emergence stage, and we're going to take into account incubation stage, and we're going to look at an illustrative case of the bionic prosthetics industry. So in the next 2 minutes, it's my job to convince you why you should find this study interesting after all of the work that's already been done in it, right? And so I'm going to start off with saying that most of the work that we know, including my own, has very much focused in this quadrant, which is economic effects definition, radical technologies are ushered by entrants and render incumbent technologies obsolete. Right? And of course, most of these studies are conducted post-commercialization. My own advisor, Gordon Klepper, when he talked about the inception of an industry, it was first commercialization, and the assumption was made that this was an innovator bringing in the commercialization, and you had very few other options other than commercializing it itself, and then you had a period where firms would then take off because there were entrants rushing in. More recently, thanks to Maka, I learned that there is a very vibrant incubation period, that in fact it's not that the innovator is the first. There could be a lot of people that are investing in this technology. And notice, however, that here the sampling on the industries is where entrants, diversifying firms, or startups usher radical technology is still maintained. Right? So two things that I want to draw your attention to in terms of sampling strategies. In both of these, we're sampling on industries where entrants usher change, and in the first quadrant, additionally, we're only sampling on entrants in the product's market. Right? This is going to be important to why I think you should find the study interesting. Now, what we're going to do is actually rely on a different definition of radical technology, one which does not create the circularity of definition. Right? So what we're going to talk about is a definition that's been around for a while, actually, and that is not defining it based on its economic effects. Radical technological systems use novel base principles. And of course, this builds on this architecture of components coming together, and the radical technology could occur either at the component level, and even if it occurs in one component, it requires a recombination and restructuration of the rest of the components too. So if you think about this, even Henderson and Clark, when they talked about the importance of architectural innovation, still sample on an industry post-commercialization where entrants ushered the architectural innovation, right? Which means, of course, that at least to the best of my knowledge, and I think I know a lot of the knowledge in this industry evolution literature, there is a white space in that quadrant out here, right? In the incubation studies, as well as using the novel-based principles. So what purchase power does this give us? Now, right off the step, Brent is a co-author. So I'm going to say the study wasn't pre-registered. Right? But more importantly, the conceptual framework that I'm providing you is based on abductive analysis, right? So what you should think about from here on, that our study's insights were informed with an abductive analysis of the data. We are not making any hypothesis testing claims, okay? So I'm going to show you statistics and, of course, the illustrative framework of the bionic prosthetics industry to illustrate, not test, this conceptual framework that I'm about to give you. Right? So our research question, given this, is really how do prior histories of economic actors affect their investments in incubating radical technologies for value creation? And then we're going to ask the follow-up question, how do their prior histories and technological investments impact their subsequent value capture strategies? So you're seeing already that we're owning the prehistories, and then we're creating kind of a process model where the creation of the radical technology requires investments in creating competencies too. And that can occur by heterogeneous actors. So our first part of our conceptual map is really owning the fact that heterogeneity in prior histories is coming from economic actors. Notice here that in addition to the established firms in the focal industry and in related industries and their employees, you can have knowledge of components as it relates to serving a focal purpose in a different way. More importantly, and this goes to Ashish's talk earlier, right? And when we're talking about economic actors at this point, not firms, because you can have other knowledge contexts, academics, use, nonprofit and public organizations where there are individuals creating novel-based principles and then thinking about how to apply them. And so this is very much in the pre-firm creation stage too. So each of these people are coming in attracted either because they have a technology that can potentially be put to a focal use, or they have an unmet need for which they're searching for a technological solution. So the creation of a radical technological system and its competencies is really this recursive process that Rosenberg talked about way back in 1969, and Arrow talks about when he's thinking about this technological system view. And of course, this means that it has to first start with experimentation. Technological investments for identification of both component knowledge and architectural knowledge that are employing these new base principles. And these can be parallel or competing investments that go on. There is a lot of knowledge sharing too, and this is both in market-based channels as well as in non-market-based collaboration that's going on. And in this process, especially when you're using market-based channels of alliances or acquisitions, you've got organizational forms emerging, as in individuals leaving to create startups, but at the same time, real rich leverage of firm boundary reorganization. Right? And so you've got lots and lots of acquisitions and divestments that are going on too, and then this is a recursive process that continues till the technological problem is solved and you have at least one commercialized product. And so then we can look at the post-commercialization economic effects, right? So notice that this really embraces the fact that in the incubation period, that's a lot going on, that if we miss out on that period and only sample past it to look at the economic effects, you're missing a lot of issues out here. And so you can have value capture not just in product markets for commercialization of product markets, but also through alliances in markets of a technology. Ashish, are you happy that I mentioned that? Yes, thank you, right. As well as acquisitions in the market for corporate control, and this relates, Charlie, to the conversation that we were having earlier about how this is knowledge recombination meeting firm reconfiguration in a very serious manner. So now notice that we didn't make any assumptions of who is ushering the technological change. And this conceptual framework applies where each of them, to the extent that they're incentivized or motivated to enter into the creation of the radical technological change, may make investments and then choose to value capture. So our abductive analysis of the quantitative data and business histories really looks at all 111 technology investing firms for incubation, and we track their prior histories. Right? And many of them, of course, we go back to the time when they weren't even startups, but they were individuals working in corporate or academic labs. And then, or they were unmet needs as users. And then we look at their value capture strategy too. And so what we're doing is really tracking. And then the other thing we do is take the top 5 firms in each of these categories in terms of their level of investment, and we dig deep into the firm histories, right? And again, when I say we, it's not Brent and I digging deep. Sojin is, that's why I'm channeling Sojin, and that's why I say you should take a close look at this very creative scholar.
Division of labor is good.
Division of labor is very good, I agree, right? And so we look at internal R&D, and external sourcing as ways of technological investments, and then we look at these 15 historical significant tech investing firms by using archives. Again, kudos, Maria, to your work, and it just tells you just how important it is to do the archival work, right? So one of the things that we find is all 3 firms invested similarly in bionics, right? So just simple descriptives show you what's going on here. 30% of them were startups, 20% were prosthetic incumbents, and 50% were established firms in other industries. Notice we're not calling them diversifying entrants because the term diversifying entrants relates to entry into the product market. All 3 of them actually integrated at least 2 component technologies. Of course, incumbents in the prosthetic market integrated more sub-technologies than startup and other established firms. And you have significant spillovers across actors in the ecosystem, both through market and non-market channels. So what you end up seeing is that all 3 firms also invested in prototyping system-level integration, right? And value capture strategy differs by firm time. So while there's no significant difference across the firms in their integration and creation of component knowledge and integration, you see significant differences between their value capture strategies. So incumbents are much, much more likely to enter the product market as opposed to the typical one that the radical technology is being ushered by entrants. And there's support for differences between other established firms and startups too. Entry in system level products, you tend to see, I'm going to skip through all of this too very quickly for times of time. Startups are much more likely to be acquired, supports the difference between established firms and ones, but more importantly, what you end up seeing is that the established firms from other industries do not necessarily participate at all in the value capture, either by entering into the industry or even by getting into markets for technology and so on. So why? Taking stock and going deeper into the context for explanations, if the industries were examined retrospectively, bionic prosthetics would have been classified as a competence-enhancing radical technology. Notice now that we're kind of contorting ourselves to say, oh, it's a radical technology because it rendered them obsolete, but it was competence enhancing, right? The nature of technology's definition actually gets rid of that contortion. But more importantly, it begs the question, why did incumbents dominate commercialization? Because all of them had invested in the creation of the technological system. Established firms in other industries represented 50% of the technological entrants, yet they chose not to commercialize bionic prosthetics. Why did they not choose to capitalize on it? And then startups captured value through acquisitions and exit by acquisition, but why and with whom did they do so, right? One of the things that these historical, I won't go into the details of this process model and the importance of motivation, other than to say, oh my gosh, how inspiring are the stories when you go down not just to the founder level of the startups and why and how they did so, but also for established firms and incumbents as to their motivations for going into bionic prosthetics. But one of the things that we found, which was super interesting, is that even before we talk about ecosystems for value capture, look at the vibrant ecosystem. So these 15 historical firms in our sample are connected in clusters with each other, and in fact are connected to 33 other firms that are in our sample that we didn't even necessarily measure, right? Thank you, Ashish, for leaving while in the middle of it. Yeah, I'm good. I'm almost done, right? So all firms leverage non-market collaborative networks and market channels, both science push and demand pull engagement. Clusters co-developed among firms with complementary knowledge. All firms created component critical technologies, and incumbents played a key role in the technological convergence. So it's not about downstream complementary capabilities that saved them. It is the complementarities even in the technological systems itself. So what have we learned at the firm level? I've already belabored this point enough. We need to be thinking about radical technologies based on the nature of technology. The commercialization focus, that's circularity is avoided. And then alternative modes of value capture allowed all firms to be engaged, and in particular, established firms from other industries utilize this knowledge in other adjacent industries. I'm going to leave this as this because I'm almost out of time. Limitations, we are a single industry study. We don't have any data on value, so this gets to Ashish's points, right? We're talking about modes of value capture, not how much is captured. And we're not claiming that there are no conditions under which incumbents won't be displaced. But we hope that our contribution is that we're understanding nascent industries, especially, and separating it from its economic impact. And I'll stop here. We still have 10 minutes, right?
All right, questions for Rashmi?
Wow, silence. Brent, you can go ahead and ask your first question.
So if there is something, just to go off the capability enhancing idea, right? So the literature is well established in that we have capability destroying and we have capability enhancing. We don't really have anything in between. So what's your suggestion then? Is there another mechanism, or is there what's just to sort of continue the thought there?
Yeah, so my view, of course, is that the need to talk about competence enhancing and competence destroying for incumbents comes from this notion that we're thinking about this technology being an external shock to the incumbents, and to the extent that incumbents are enabling it, well, then maybe it's not a radical technology whatsoever. So for me, my concept, at least what I learned from this study, is that these capabilities, some of them are destroyed or rendered less important. In this context, the capability that was most at stake were the mechanical controls. But we find that actually the mechanical controls are still being used by the incumbents, but they're being enhanced by the bionic components itself. And then the other capabilities they built on, so materials and design, that was very important to conduct downstream R&D, the development element too. So we find this capability enhancing for sure, but again, several incumbents chose not to come in to bionic prosthetics, while many of them did choose to come in. So again, the endogeneity is what we would call to question in that whole distinction of competency enhancing versus destroying. Brent, you can add some too if you'd like. I should have said, all questions should be directed to Brent.
Gary has a question, so
And
you
Gary.
can direct.
Yeah. Go ahead, Gary.
I'm gonna focus forward, but you can take it back. I guess so. I think you made an extremely powerful case for not looking under the street lamp, and I think especially as we study entrepreneurship, it's so critical. If it's already canned data, there's so many assumptions baked into it, and that was a very powerful thing. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I was just wondering if you can help us both because of the method and because of the plethora of kind of approaches that were there. Can you help us navigate the descriptive to the normative? So there's a lot of data about what firms have done. How should we start taking this insight in terms of what advice should we give firms as to what they should be doing? So kind of taking that next step.
Brent wants to take that.
Yeah, so what's the insights that we got from like Nate and Brian Arthur, et cetera, was like it's imperative to think about the technology as a system and isolate which parts of the system are changing. And that's really specific to a technology. So if I take this and I want to apply these insights in a different industry, I have to map the technological system in that industry and ask the question, what's being changed there? Because I guarantee you that what we found in this particular industry, you will not find in a different one necessarily. Rather, you take the tool and the framework, which is, hey, I'm going to map the industry system. I'm going to figure out which components are changing, which are not changing, and how that relates to the creation of value. And then map the firms onto that, and the people onto that. And then I can start thinking about what sort of dynamics you might expect to see.
So, and again, to build on this, because I was part of the study with Maka on agricultural biotechnology, to Brent's point, we can take that conceptual framework and put it in ag biotechnology, but then we see that diversifying entrants become more important because of their role in the integration of prior stock of incumbents' capabilities that were rendered obsolete because the hybridization of corn and seeds was an old technology that the biotech completely replaced. But the hybrid was retained value because these were already customized to local conditions. So you ended up having the incumbents be acquired. But that's still consistent with the framework, even though the dynamics were very different. Charlie.
So I'm just, because you have this incredible richness of data and both of these studies you're talking about, have you looked at the types of problems that the different types of players were addressing? Both type as in, the stylized Ashisha's technical versus commercial, or component versus architecture, or number of problems? Are incumbents integrating more, so they're tackling more problems together, where startups have really, really focused solutions to individual problem? I'm just curious if you looked at all at this.
Yes,
level.
yes. And in fact, those were the things that I rushed through, and also the historical deep dives. How did Ashish say this is a trailer? Please read the paper, right? So those are the details that we get into, and indeed, they all integrate, but incumbents integrate more. And as far
Better, also? Do they integrate better?
Um,
Hard to say that.
that's hard to say, right? But yes, one thing that we do find is true is that the prototypes that are created, in order to take it down to commercialization, that's where the incumbents have an advantage too, right? So there are a lot more. So I think that this paper is very consistent with what Ashish was talking about in terms of commercialization and technological solution challenges. But I think that there's a lot more richness because you're not just thinking about it as a technology, but as we were saying, a system of technologies. So there are many, many component level issues that come up. And it's fascinating. And again, like I said, so inspiring.
If I were to map this industry onto Ashish's, what is it, like V? This is like at the bottom.
At the bottom of the V.
Like this is a crappy hard market to be in. It just is. And so if you saw the same technological preconditions in a really, really like lucrative market, you might see completely different patterns, right? Because then all of a sudden it makes sense to invest and build those capabilities or something like that.
All right, and with that, for our last 2 minutes, I'd like to open it up. Luisa's still here. If you have questions for her, also move for Rashmi. Ashish is left. So